There is a kind of silence that lives inside official paper, and it is not the silence of nothing being there. It is the silence of something left out on purpose, by rule, by a decision made long before the man with the ledger ever set his boots on the frozen ground. In the autumn of 1879, the United States was preparing to count itself again, as it had every 10 years since 1790, and the men chosen to do the counting were issued bound schedules, printed instructions, thick with rules, and a single command that mattered more than all the rest. They were to record the inhabitants of the country. The difficulty was never in the walking. The difficulty lived inside the word inhabitants, and in the question, already answered above the enumerator's head, of who the law had decided did not qualify to be one. Picture one of these men, on a grey morning, at the edge of a territory that had not yet become a state, his breath visible in the cold, the heavy book held under one arm, walking toward a cluster of dwellings, with smoke rising from the chimneys, and children at the doorways, and the plain, undeniable evidence of a living settlement laid out in front of him. He would count what he saw with his own eyes, because that was the work, and the count he carried it into would record, in the exact place where those people stood, that no one lived there at all. That gap between the man who saw and the record that refused to hold what he saw is the whole of this account. If this record has your attention, hit the like button and subscribe, and leave a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It matters to know who is paying attention to this. To understand what that man carried, you have to understand the machine he served, because the Census of the United States was the instrument that decided power, and it had been since the country wrote itself into being, never a simple ledger of names gathered out of curiosity. In the first article of the Constitution, in the second section, sits the command that the people be counted once every 10 years, and that the number produced by that count determined two things of enormous consequence: how many representatives each state would send to the capital, and how the weight of certain direct taxes would be divided among them. A person recorded in the count was a person who added weight to a place, who pulled a fraction of national power toward the ground they stood on. A person left out of the count was, for every purpose the machine existed to serve, a person who did not bear on the arrangement of the republic at all. They could live and work and die in full view, and the structure of representation would proceed exactly as if they had never drawn breath. The stakes of being counted reached even further than the seats in the capital. Population was the currency of political standing in a growing country. A territory's path to becoming a state ran in part through the count, for the old principle written into the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 had fixed a population threshold of 60,000 free inhabitants as the gate through which a territory could ask for full statehood, and the censuses that followed inherited the idea that numbers on a page were what turned raw land into a recognized part of the nation. To be counted was to exist politically. To go uncounted was to remain, in the eyes of the federal arithmetic, a kind of blank space on the map of power, and the count did this work again and again, on a schedule without end. After every enumeration, the seats in the House of Representatives were redistributed among the states according to the new figures, a process that could hand a rising state additional voices in the capital and strip them from a state whose share of the population had slipped. The census was not a single historical act, but a recurring redistribution of national power, repeated every 10 years, and each repetition carried the same exclusion forward into the new arrangement. The people defined out of the count in 1880 were defined out of the apportionment that followed it, and the one after that, for as long as the four words held. Their absence was a permanent feature of the machine, rebuilt faithfully at every turn of the decade, an emptiness reproduced on purpose each time the country sat down to measure itself. Never a single missed tally that some later count might quietly correct. From the first enumeration in 1790, the labor of the count had fallen to the United States Marshals and the assistants they hired by the season, men who rode from farm to farm and door to door with whatever paper they could carry, writing down the head of each household and the number of souls beneath each roof. For 9 decades, the system held together in that rough, improvised form, and by the 1870s, it had begun to buckle under the size of the country it was asked to measure. A country that now stretched across a continent and filled with people faster than any marshal could chase them. So in the spring of 1879, the Congress took the whole apparatus apart and rebuilt it. A new law reorganized the census from the ground up, retired the long reliance on the marshals, and created in their place a trained body of supervisors and enumerators, appointed and instructed for the single purpose of measuring the nation with more care than the old method allowed. The enumeration that followed in 1880 was the first carried out under this new design, worked by tens of thousands of enumerators, moving through districts drawn for the purpose, and the men who walked it stood at a hinge in the history of the count, the last to inherit the old way of doing things, and the first to carry the new. The new system was elaborate. Above the enumerators stood a layer of supervisors, more than 150 of them, each responsible for the districts within a region, and the whole effort was anchored to a single fixed point in time. Every person in the country was to be recorded as they stood on one particular day, the 1st of June, 1880, so that the entire population might be frozen together in one common instant, regardless of when the enumerator actually reached a given door. A family that existed on that day was meant to be counted on that day. A man who died the week before it, or a child born the week after, fell on the wrong side of a line drawn through a single morning. They received the printed schedules with their ruled columns, the standardized questions, the instruction to record every inhabitant they encountered, and they inherited, without anyone in the chain above them marking it as anything worth a second thought, the oldest exclusion the document contained. The same founding article that ordered the count to be made carried within it 4 words that decided the standing of entire nations of people. The whole number of persons was to be counted, the article said, excluding Indians not taxed. Those 4 words, excluding Indians not taxed, had been set into the Constitution at the moment of its writing, and then, after the Civil War remade so much of the country's law, they were carried forward again. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, rewrote the rules of representation for a transformed nation, struck the old arithmetic that had counted an enslaved person as 3/5 of a human being, and in the course of that rewriting reached the question of the native nations and chose to keep the exclusion exactly where it had always been. The framers of the amendment had the clause in front of them. They left it standing. The meaning was precise, and the consequence of it was vast, beyond easy reckoning. A person who lived within one of the tribal nations, who held to its government and its land, and was not subject to the taxation of the states, was by the plain definition of the law not to be added to the number that determined representation. The legal ground beneath that exclusion had been laid decades earlier. In 1831, in the case of the Cherokee Nation against the state of Georgia, the Supreme Court, under Chief Justice John Marshall, had described the tribes as domestic dependent nations, peoples who lived inside the borders of the United States, and yet stood in a separate and unusual relation to it, neither foreign countries nor ordinary citizens. That separateness, useful to the courts and the treaty makers, became the doorway through which the count walked past them. They might be farming ground their families had worked for generations. They might be trading, building, raising children, burying their dead, governing themselves through institutions far older than the republic that declined to count them. And the official population of the United States, the single number that the entire machine existed to produce, would pass over them as though the land they occupied held no one at all. The affairs of these nations fell to a particular agency, the Office of Indian Affairs, which sat inside the Department of the Interior, having been moved there from the War Department decades before, and that office kept its own separate ledgers, its own agency rolls, its own counts taken for the practical business of distributing rations and enforcing treaties and managing the people under its authority. Those numbers existed. They were written and filed and consulted. They were simply not the same numbers, and they did not flow into the population of the nation. The size of the gap between the two is the thing that is hardest to hold steadily in the mind. By the estimates that survive from the period, something close to 250,000 people were living across the Western Territories, the reservations, and the lands not yet organized into states, a population already cut down by decades of disease and war, and forced removal from a figure that had once stood many times higher. 250,000 people, living in agencies and settlements and gathered towns with their own names and seasons and graveyards, occupying a place in the official count of their own country that came, through the quiet operation of 4 printed words, to exactly 0. When the counting was finished and the figures were drawn together, the official population of the United States stood at just over 50 million people. That number became the country, for the purposes of power, for the 10 years that followed. The 250,000 who had been defined out of it were not subtracted from the total, because they had never been entered into it to begin with. They were not a loss, the figure recorded. They were an absence the figure was built around. What the record shows, when you finally set the law down beside the ground it described, is not a secret, and it was never hidden, and that is the part of this that takes the longest to absorb. The exclusion was not buried in a vault, or whispered between officials. It was printed, it was public, it was read aloud in the chambers where the 14th Amendment was argued, and it sat in plain text in every copy of the Constitution that any citizen could open and read by lamplight. The erasure took place in the open air, inside the dry and patient machinery of definition, in a decision about which living person met the meaning of the word inhabitant and which did not. The enumerator out in the territory was never instructed to lie about what he saw. He was instructed to record the inhabitants, and the rules standing above him had already settled, before he ever raised his hand to knock, that certain people did not count as inhabitants in the sense the apportionment required. The work itself was hard, exact, and physical. The schedule he carried asked of every person a long row of questions: the name, the age at the last birthday, the sex, the color, the relation to the head of the family, whether married or single or widowed, the occupation, whether the person could read, whether they could write, the place of their birth, and the birthplaces of their father and mother, each answer written by hand in its narrow column. He was to visit every dwelling in his district, and in the Western Territories, a single district might stretch across hundreds of square miles of plain and mountain and river bottom, so that a man could ride for the better part of a day between one homestead and the next, the ink half frozen in the bottle, the bound book swelling with damp, his own hand cramping in the cold as he set down, household by household, the living population of a piece of the country. Some of those men wrote down what stood in front of them, regardless of the rule. The 1880 schedule carried a column for what it called color, and the choices printed there included a category for Indian, alongside white and black, and the others the count recognized, so that an enumerator who met a native family living apart from the tribal nations, drawn into the general life of a territory, could and did record them in the ordinary population. But the people the 4 words were written to exclude, those living within the nations and not taxed, sat in a different position entirely. Where an enumerator chose to record them at all, their names landed on pages that did not feed the apportionment, a record kept beside the record that governed, present in the ink and absent from the total. The distance between those 2 pages is the entire subject of this film. To see what that exclusion actually erased, you have to look at the kind of place it was applied to, because the towns it passed over were not always rough camps or scattered lodges. Some of them were among the most organized settlements in the interior of the continent. In the 1830s, under the Indian Removal Act, signed into law in 1830, the federal government had forced the great nations of the Southeast, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Creek, and the Seminole, off their ancestral lands and driven them west, along the routes remembered as the Trail of Tears, into the territory set aside for them in what is now Oklahoma. They laid out capitals. The Cherokee established their seat of government at Tahlequah, and there they raised a council house, courts of law, and schools, and they governed themselves under a written constitution they had adopted years before, set down in their own language, using the syllabary that the man named Sequoyah had created, so that an entire people could read and write their own tongue. They printed newspapers. The presses of the Cherokee Nation produced a paper, the Cherokee Advocate, printed in both English and the Cherokee characters, carrying the laws and the news of a functioning republic. The Choctaw and the Creek and the others built their own capitals and their own courts and their own schools nearby. These were towns in every sense the word can carry. They had streets and printing offices and elected officials and graveyards and the ordinary daily traffic of people living settled lives. And when the Census of the United States counted the country around them, these capitals, with their constitutions and their newspapers and their courts, stood inside the figure as nothing, because the people who built them were Indians not taxed, living in nations the law had defined as separate, and the four words reached them exactly where they stood. A traveler could walk down a street in Tahlequah, past a working newspaper office and a council house full of elected men, and the official population of the country would hold, for that street and that town, a perfect and total zero. The southeastern nations were not alone in being uprooted and then rebuilding in a place the count would not credit. In 1864, the United States Army forced thousands of Navajo people onto a long march, remembered as the Long Walk, away from their homeland to a barren reservation at Bosque Redondo in the New Mexico Territory, where they were held for years in conditions that killed many of them, before a treaty in 1868 finally allowed the survivors to return west and rebuild their lives on a fraction of their former land. The communities they re-established, the herds they rebuilt, the families they put back together on the high desert, occupied the same position in the federal arithmetic as every other gathered nation. They were there, and they were not counted. Across the West, the same shape repeated under different names and in different decades. A people moved, a people rebuilding, and a population figure that recorded the moving and the suffering in the files of the army and the Indian agents, while leaving the rebuilt towns out of the number that decided the shape of the nation. And then there is the second silence, which has nothing to do with the law and everything to do with the clock. The count came once, and then not again for 10 years. The country in the 1870s and 1880s was moving far faster than that slow decennial pulse could follow. In the territories of the interior, in the mining districts, strung through the mountains and across the high plains, a town was rarely a permanent thing. It rose where the metal was found, swelled to thousands of people inside a single season, threw up saloons and assay offices, and stamp mills and printing presses, and a graveyard on the hill, and then, when the vein pinched out, or the placer ran dry, emptied as fast as it had filled, sometimes faster. A town could be born, live its entire crowded life, and die again inside the 10 years that separated one census from the next, and the count would never learn it had existed. If this investigation is still with you, subscribe and turn on notifications. There is more buried here than any single film can contain. Your attention is what makes it possible to keep pulling this forward. Consider the year of the reorganization itself. In 1879, in the dust of the Arizona Territory, a prospectors' strike gave rise to the town of Tombstone, which would draw thousands of people to a patch of desert that had held almost none. In the high country of Colorado, the silver camp of Leadville had exploded across the previous 2 years into one of the largest settlements in the territory, a place of stamp mills and opera and sudden violent fortune, sitting near the roof of the continent. In the Black Hills of the Dakota Territory, gold had pulled tens of thousands of people into a region the United States had, by the treaty signed at Fort Laramie in 1868, solemnly promised would remain closed to white settlement and reserved to the Lakota. An expedition led into those hills in 1874, reported the gold. The rush followed within a year, and the town of Deadwood grew up out of that violation in 1876, a settlement that existed before it had any legal right to exist, on ground the official map of the country did not acknowledge as open to it. Farther west, in the high desert of California, the town of Bodie swelled past several thousand residents in the very years around 1879 and 1880, a place with banks and rival newspapers and a main street that ran the better part of a mile, and within a few decades it would stand wholly empty, its timber drying and silvering in the wind. On the Comstock, Virginia City, in the state of Nevada, had pulled a silver fortune out of the mountain and built mansions and an opera house on the proceeds, and even there the census could seize the place only in the single frozen instant of account, blind to everything the town had been the year before and would become the year after. The mining camps were not the only towns the calendar swallowed. When the Transcontinental Railroad was driven across the West in the 1860s, the construction itself dragged a moving town along behind the railhead, a traveling settlement of graders and track layers, and the merchants and gamblers and saloon keepers who followed the payroll. These places had names and populations of thousands. They threw up tents and plank buildings at the end of the track, lived for a few weeks or a few months while the work passed through, and then loaded themselves onto flat cars and moved on to the next stopping point, leaving the prairie behind them, as bare as they had found it. People called them the towns that moved. A man could be born or buried in one of them, and the place itself would be 40 miles down the line by the time any census taker thought to look for it, and gone from the earth entirely by the time the next decennial count came around. The country was full of these temporary, intense, completely real settlements that the 10-year rhythm of the count had no way to hold. Towns that existed with total certainty for everyone who lived in them, and with no existence at all in the only record the nation kept of itself. The enumerator walked into all this churn carrying a schedule designed for a settled country of farms and townships and parish-steady populations, and he was asked to pin a violently moving thing to paper in one still photograph taken once a decade. The towns that happened to be alive on the day he arrived were recorded, fixed in the count for that one moment. The towns that had lived and died in the gap between his visit and the previous one were simply gone, with no line in any federal ledger to testify that thousands of people had arrived and labored and married and been buried in a place the count never saw. Lay those two silences side by side, the one written into the law and the one written into the calendar, and the official population of the United States in this period becomes something far stranger than a census of a country. It becomes a portrait of the nation with deliberate holes cut into it, a map that left out, by rule and by timing both, a great many of the people who were genuinely, physically standing on the land. The mechanism of the erasure, once you trace it back to its source, was never a single order signed by a single hand on a single afternoon. It was the slow, lawful, almost clerical operation of a definition, and that is exactly what makes it so difficult to see and so difficult to undo. No one needed to send soldiers to burn the towns of the Western nations in order to remove them from the population of the country. The count had been built, from its first article, to pass over them without effort, the way water passes over a stone it has worn smooth. But the years that followed the 1880 enumeration did bring a more active kind of unmaking, and that one too arrived, dressed in the calm language of law and reform and improvement, which is how the most consequential things in this story always seem to arrive. In 1887, the Congress passed the General Allotment Act, remembered now by the name of the Massachusetts senator who carried it, Henry Dawes. Its stated and openly published purpose was to remake the members of the tribal nations into individual property owners on the model the lawmakers preferred, to break the communal ownership of reservation land into separate parcels handed out to separate families. Its practical effect, across the decades it ran, was the dissolution of the very settlements the census had already declined to count. Land that had been held in common by a whole people was surveyed and carved into individual allotments, and the vast remainder, the portion declared surplus to what the government decided a family needed, was opened to settlers arriving from outside. The gathered communities that had organized their life on that land, the agencies and the towns that functioned as towns in every respect except the federal definition of the word, were pulled apart, parcel by parcel and family by family. People who had lived close were scattered onto separate, distant holdings. The communal centers lost the very ground that had held them together in one place. Across the span of the allotment era, something on the order of 90 million acres of tribal land, by most accountings, passed out of native hands through this lawful machinery, and the human geography that the census had long treated as empty was made, in a great many places, genuinely emptier, broken down into the scattered and separated pattern the law had decided was better for the people it was breaking apart. The nations of the Indian Territory met a particular and pointed version of this unmaking. In 1893, the Congress created a commission, headed by the same Senator Dawes, to negotiate the end of communal landholding among the 5 tribes, and to enroll their members, one by one, onto official lists, the rolls that came to carry his name. To receive an allotment, a person had to appear on those rolls, and so the government at last produced a careful, exhaustive count of the very people its census had spent a lifetime excluding, not in order to bring them into the nation, but in order to dissolve the nations they belonged to. 5 years later, the Curtis Act of 1898 stripped the tribal governments of the territory of their authority, abolished their courts, and set the machinery in motion to wind up their separate existence. The council house at Tahlequah and the capitals like it lost the governments that had filled them. In 1907, the Indian Territory and the neighboring Oklahoma Territory were joined together and admitted to the Union as the single state of Oklahoma, and the nations that had built towns there with their own constitutions were folded, at last, into the count, on the far side of having lost the self-government those towns had been built to hold. The enrollment that finally numbered them was, in the end, the instrument of their dissolution. The agencies were renamed, and the boundaries were redrawn, and the names of places shifted across the maps as the old arrangements gave way to the new, and a child born into a gathered community in 1870 might, by the closing years of the century, be living alone on an isolated allotment in a landscape that no longer resembled in any way the one the census had failed to record a generation earlier. What replaced the old towns was dispersal itself, administered through the same quiet institutional channels that had produced the 4 words in the Constitution in the first place. The absence that had begun its life as a blank in a ledger was, through allotment, slowly and deliberately carved into the ground as well. The policy did eventually reach its end. In 1934, a new law, the Indian Reorganization Act, finally halted the allotment of tribal land and tried to reverse some part of what the previous half-century had done. But by then the damage was decades deep. The 90 million acres had already changed hands, and the gathered settlements the old census had passed over had in many places ceased to exist in any form that a later, fair account could ever have found. Return now to the man with the ledger, because his part of this does not end at the edge of the settlement on that cold morning. Consider what a man like that carried home with him after a season in the field, and what he went on carrying for the rest of his life. He had stood in front of doorways that the country he served would record as empty. In some places he had written down the names of people whose very existence the apportionment would not admit, and he had known as the pen moved that the page beneath it would not shift a single seat in the capital, would not move the official population of the United States by even one. There were districts he had walked where, a decade earlier, a whole town had stood, a town now vanished so completely that there was no column anywhere in his schedule for a place that had already finished its entire life. A man who has seen that does not unsee it. He grows old, holding a knowledge the record does not share with him, the plain knowledge that the country had more people in it and had held more towns in it than the official number would ever once confess. He had walked across the gap with his own boots. He had written, here and there, in its margins. He had seen, too, how the country could count people when it wanted something from them. He knew that the agents on the reservations tallied heads for the issue of rations and the payment of annuities, that careful lists were drawn up so the government could measure out flour and beef and money against an exact number of souls. What the country lacked was never the ability to count these people. They had always been countable, numbered for supply and control, with a precision the apportionment never troubled to match. What decided their place was the purpose the count was put to, and whether the number, once taken, was permitted to mean anything about who belonged to the nation and who held a claim on its power. And if, late in his life, he had tried to point to where those people and those towns had been, he would have found that the very instrument that might have preserved them, the federal record itself, had been constructed from its first article to look past exactly the people he was trying to point to, and that in one particular and singular and almost unaccountable instance, the record had been lost outright. The census that came after his, the enumeration of 1890, was the one that finally made a serious and systematic effort to count the native population of the reservations, to gather the very people the earlier counts had defined away into special schedules built for the purpose. For the first time, the machine bent itself deliberately toward the people it had spent a century ignoring. And then, on a January night in 1921, a fire broke out in the basement of the Commerce Building in Washington, in the room where the original schedules of the 1890 census were stored. The flames and the water poured in to fight them destroyed very nearly the entire enumeration, the most ambitious attempt the United States had yet made to count the people it had spent its whole existence leaving out was, with only a few scattered fragments surviving, simply gone, burned and soaked into pulp before the great majority of it had ever been read or studied by anyone. The record that might at last have answered for the long silence was itself silenced, this time not by anyone's design, but by accident laid down on top of a century of deliberate exclusion, which is a cruelty of its own particular kind. The men who had walked the earlier counts were dying off by then in any case, old enumerators and old assistant marshals carrying field memories that no surviving page could any longer confirm or contradict. Whatever a particular one of them had seen at a particular doorway, in a particular territory, on a particular freezing morning, whatever crowded living town he had passed through, that the record never once held, went down into the ground with him when he died. There was no archive anywhere that contained it. There could not be. The archive had been built, from its opening article, to contain something else, and the one time it reached further than usual, the fire took what it had gathered. What remains, at the end of all of it, is stranger and more unsettling than a sealed vault waiting somewhere for a brave hand to open it, because it has been sitting in plain sight the entire time, readable by anyone who cares to look. The 4 words are still there. Open the Constitution of the United States today, turn to the first article and the second section, find the clause that orders the people to be counted, and you will see the phrase, "excluding Indians not taxed," printed exactly where the framers set it down, carried forward into the second section of the 14th Amendment, and left standing in the living law of the country to this day. The practice built on those words did change, slowly, over the long decades that followed. The enumeration of 1900 reached further toward the excluded population than any count before it had managed. The Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 at last declared every native person born within the country to be a citizen of it, and the counting that came afterward began, by degrees, to include the people the early census had so precisely defined out of existence. But the words themselves were never struck from the text. They remain there to be read, a small and exact monument to the decision they record, preserved in the founding law the way an insect is preserved in amber, perfectly visible and perfectly past. The towns remain as well, some of them, held in the very condition the country left them. Bodie still stands out in the California desert, kept by the state in what its caretakers call a state of arrested decay. Its empty houses and its dust-deep main street open to anyone willing to drive the long road to reach it. A town the census could only ever catch, in single frozen instants, now held frozen on purpose, for good. Deadwood survived its rush and grew into a permanent town, and it keeps to this day the memory of the gold that built it on ground that had been promised, in writing, to another people entirely. And scattered all across the mountain west, in the high passes and the dry interior basins, lie the bare foundations of 100 smaller towns that lived and died inside a single census gap, marked now by nothing more than a grid of cut stones half swallowed by the grass, a collapsed timber headframe leaning over a flooded shaft, a fenced graveyard whose carved names appear in no federal population that was ever tallied. Each of those vanished places once held people who were never counted, and the silence over them was never broken, because the count that might have spoken for them came too late, or came and burned, or by its own oldest rule was never meant to speak for them at all. The record of a country is supposed to be the country remembering itself. When the record is built to forget, the forgetting does not stay on the page. It moves out into the world. It empties the towns it declined to write down, scatters the people it declined to number, and leaves behind a landscape that looks, to a later eye, as though it really had always been empty, as though the official silence had simply been telling the truth. The work of this account is to stand in one of those silent places and say that it was not empty, that the silence was made, and that the making can be traced, document by document, and law by law, back to 4 words and the long century of decisions that kept them in force. If the camera could somehow travel back to that grey morning in the autumn of 1879, it would find the man with the ledger still there, still walking toward the smoke and the doorways, and the children at the thresholds, still carrying the heavy bound schedule and the printed instruction to record the inhabitants of the country. It would watch him count what stood in front of him with his own 2 eyes, honestly, the way the work demanded. And then it would watch that honest count carried into a machine that had already decided, by 4 words written into the law a full century before the man was born, that in the place where he stood there was no one at all to be found. The people were there, the towns were there. The record said otherwise, and the record did not say it by accident or by oversight. It said it because saying it was exactly what the record had been built, from its very first article, to do. Thank you for staying with this until the end. If what you heard here stayed with you, the other films on your screen continue the record. Subscribe if you haven't, and I will see you in the next one.